So good afternoon, everyone. As we get started, I wanted to provide a refresher of the three broad categories of state wildlife action species. State Wildlife Action Plan species. ODFW used a process intended to be transparent, robust, and repeatable to identify species included within our SWAP. We'll walk through each of the categories on the screen to provide better information on what these classifications mean, how we're using them, and how you can help refine our draft. Our species of greatest conservation need, or SGCNs, are the species we've identified as having imperiled conservation status and are what we previously referred to as strategy species. The name change, similar to the name change of the plan, will help us be more in line with national terminology and facilitate use of our plan by partners that cross state boundaries. The next big group is our species of greatest information need, or SGIN. These are species for which we just don't know enough to determine their status. And these were previously referred to as data gap species. Our third group is other. There are a number of ways that we're including species that aren't species of greatest information need or species of greatest conservation need in the revised SWAP. As we all know, there are species that are key to informing conservation actions in the state that may not fall neatly within either of the two previous categories. Next slide, please. To inform our discussion of outcomes, let's walk through our criteria for selection of species of greatest conservation need. Staff led a comprehensive process to revise the criteria for selection of species of greatest conservation need in 2023. The conservation criteria developed were based on those used in 2016, with changes to make them more inclusive of all taxa. In previous iterations, different criteria were used for different taxonomic groups, which could become confusing. The end result was 4 criteria that were applied to all potential species of greatest conservation need and species assessed. Must meet 2 or more of the 4 criteria to be included as a species of greatest conservation need. The criteria are intended to identify species that are most at risk in Oregon and for which timely implementation of conservation measures to address existing or potential threats is needed for delisting or to prevent them from declining to the point of qualifying as threatened or endangered. As a reminder, the Oregon SWAP is non-regulatory. Likewise, the species designation, species of greatest conservation need and species of greatest information need are also non-regulatory, but they're meant to guide conservation priorities and actions in the state. Next slide, please. Since today's focus is on our species of greatest conservation need, I want to dig in even further into the language of each of the 4 criteria. Criterion 1 broadly is that a species is vulnerable to threats due to life history traits or ecological characteristics. An example here would be the wren tit. This is a species that is remarkably sedentary, rarely dispersing more than a few hundred meters from where they hatch. Average dispersal distance is only about 400 meters. This characteristic means that local populations are at risk of becoming isolated following catastrophic loss or habitat destruction, and areas where the population of wren tits is removed would not be quickly repopulated from arrival of dispersing individuals. There are possibly 2 distinct subspecies in Oregon, suggesting higher conservation importance in coastal Oregon. Next slide, please. The next criterion presented here in full is that the population is low or declining, either in the ecoregion or statewide. An example here would be a species like the tufted puffin, where the population has plummeted dramatically and we only have a few hundred left in the state. Next slide, please. Third criterion is that the species is at risk because of its restricted distribution. For this criterion, think of species like the yellow rail with its disjunct distribution in Oregon. Next slide, please. Finally, we have the 4th criterion. The population is vulnerable to major threats, for example, disease, invasive species, or climate change. With the rise of impacts from climate change, new emerging diseases, and spread of invasive species, this particular criterion was one that we had to be thoughtful with applying. An example here is the threat of climate change-induced drought on migrating shorebirds. Late Lake Ebert, along with Great Salt Lake and Mono Lake, support 40 to 60% of the world population of Wilson's phalaropes and up to 90% of adults during molt migration. Greater than 100,000 birds use Lake Ebert during the molt migration, and this is a vital stopover for the species. Lakes form unique staging and breeding habitat for the species between North America and wintering areas in Peru and Argentina. Major ecological concerns due to climate change-induced drought include inability of vital brine shrimp prey to tolerate resulting increases in water salinity. Next slide, please. Now that we've outlined the 4 criteria for species of greatest conservation need, I want to briefly touch on the other species category before we go into our species outcomes. Other species. These are the species with secure populations that don't meet the criteria for species of greatest conservation need or species of greatest information need, but there is other reason for us to focus conservation actions on these species. We wanted to make sure that these species too are described in the SWOP, and we could provide information about them in order to help support our partners and the public interested in advancing conservation. For example, acorn woodpeckers were assessed for inclusion on the list of species of greatest conservation need, formerly strategy species, under the 4 criteria. They were not found to meet the definition of a species of greatest conservation need under these criteria. That said, acorn woodpeckers are an excellent indicator of oak woodland habitats, and their populations are increasing due to oak woodland management and conservation. Acorn woodpecker will be highlighted in the habitat section of the SWOP and are a success story about conservation actions in oak woodland ecosystems. Another example is the pileated woodpecker, which also did not meet the definition of a species of greatest conservation need under the criteria. However, the pileated woodpecker is a habitat engineer and provides valuable ecosystem service by easily excavating tree cavities. These cavities are utilized by species which are not as capable of creating cavities on their own for breeding, shelter, and resting. Next slide, please. So getting to the ask. Our ask is for partners to provide us with technical information. The draft list of species that have been assessed to date by ODFW is presented in the bird spreadsheet on the revision website, in addition to the draft list of bird species of greatest conservation need and greatest information need. For species on the draft list, we're looking for technical partners to review the profiles for factual accuracy, missing information, and being current. For any proposed changes or addition, we ask that reviewers please submit peer-reviewed references and supporting materials that can help inform final decisions. We recognize the value of traditional and cultural information in addition to scientific data. Finally, we're looking to technical reviewers to identify any additional information needs or actions critical to the conservation of the species. SWOP is a document that is widely available and heavily used, with over 120,000 unique users each year. If partners can help us make sure we have high-quality information on threats and conservation actions, this information can go to help support effective conservation by practitioners around our state. Next slide, please. To help document your feedback, and I just want to put this up briefly, we've provided a form on the revision website. Some of you may have already seen it. It's the Species Information Comment Form. Though we will be taking notes today, please use this tool to provide us with your comments. We will step through the form at the end of our gathering today. Next slide, please. With this background in mind, we're now looking to you and the asks we have from you. The species lists and profile documents of species of greatest conservation need and species of greatest information need were made available prior to this meeting. We're asking for your help principally on ecoregion designations, special needs, threats, and conservation actions. When making suggestions, wherever possible, please provide appropriate peer-reviewed reference and published sources. Next slide, please. We assessed 141 bird species in our review. 58 were recommended as species of greatest conservation need, with 11 species new to the list of birds. These include pinyon jay and Wilson's phalarope. Both petitioned for federal listing under the ESA, and the California condor, an endangered species which is being released from the captive breeding recovery program in Northern California and are likely to occur in Oregon during the life of the next Oregon swap. Next slide, please. 15 species have been newly proposed as species of greatest information need, such as Bowes swift and long-eared owl. As an example of information needs is for hummingbirds. Common methods for monitoring population trends, such as the breeding bird survey, don't work that well for hummingbirds. Identifying these gaps and being more thoughtful about survey methodology for hummingbirds will help us to fill critical information needs. Next slide, please. For each species of greatest conservation need, we're asking for your review on content in these categories: ecoregions, special needs, threats and limiting factors, data gaps, and conservation actions. For example, are the species ecoregions accurate? Ecoregions listed are where conservation actions are prioritized, not necessarily all ecoregions in which the species occurs. Is the information presented for each species accurate and complete for each category? Draft content is available on the SWAP revision website. Please provide your feedback through the revision website by April 4th, and sooner is even more helpful. Next slide, please. For each species of greatest information need, we're looking for your expertise to identify information needs and data gaps that will help us determine conservation status of the species. This information is also needed to evaluate whether each species meets the criteria of a species of greatest conservation need. For example, these information needs could look like assessing population distribution and trends, identifying species-specific habitat needs, identifying threats and limiting factors. Specifically calling out the factors needed to determine conservation status will help guide our collective work on these species into the future. Again, please provide your information through the revision website by April 4th, and sooner is most helpful. Next slide, please. We've received some very helpful feedback. Species distribution maps have been provided of modeled climate change scenarios. This is information we can link to in the updated SWAP. Emerging key references have also been provided. We've received newly modeled information on species' ability to adapt to climate change, and additional information needs have been identified.